All yours.
All nine, right. So today's webinar was on request on how to read the literature with a problem and not a solution focus. So we hope that as a general learning outcome, you will develop a better understanding about the difference in between a problem and a solution-focused reading lens, and more specifically to understand what constitutes a research problem in the first instance, to learn why there's an apparent difficulty in developing a problem understanding. We will, with this, introduce the solution bias and distinguish that to how to read the literature with a problem focus. And in the fifth part, we then will look into practice on how to draw on comparative evidence and data, and not only on conclusions. And as said, the webinar will close with an interactive group discussion started with breakout sessions in which Jacqueline will divide people into small chunk of groups, and afterwards a closing joint reflection round. The group discussion activity towards the end, it's optional. If you do not want to participate, you're welcome to leave. Now, with this, what constitutes a research problem in the first place? Now, while quite obvious, but it is not a solution. It is not a question, means it doesn't come with a question mark. It's also not a title, and it's certainly not an opinion or specification. The characteristics of a research problem are, it's a situation that is basically, in the most simple way expressed, broke. It shows ideally some cause and effect relationships, ideally because not always you will be able to observe those directly. If you look, for example, at wicked problems, you often don't see any direct cause and effect relations. And ideally, it has some boundaries and therefore can be expressed in a short and precise sentence, despite those boundaries usually will be worked out during your thesis study only. It is a real and not an abstract or hypothetical thing. And with this, it is based on things that can be observed and that have some evidence. And it can be either the starting point of your research or the end point of the research. If you feel that there's something not right, but still can't tell what it actually is that doesn't feel right, then that's fine. It just means that your research very likely will focus on understanding what the actual problem is. Now, this is very different towards having the research problem at the end point. If the problem is relatively clear to you, then the research problem likely constitutes the starting point. Commonly, if you go for quantitative studies, that will be the case. And with qualitative studies, it might depend more on the case. If the problem is very vague, on the other hand, you might need to focus your research on developing an understanding about what the exact problem is. In this second case, the research problem or the understanding thereof will be rather the end point of your research, but not the starting point. Means most of the research you will be focusing on understanding the problem better. Now, let's look into an example for research problem as being the start point. In this case, the organization is showing a high fluctuation rate, as the leadership team is lacking people management skills. So let's look into this further. The above example clears a broken situation. A high fluctuation rate is not expected to be there. And it also shows a cause and effect relationship. We have an initial understanding why there is a high fluctuation rate resulting from lacking people management skills in the leadership team. So this is actually an initial observation and evidence that we can bring into the case. And while the problem seems to be clear, the reason why the leadership team is lacking people management skills might be very much unclear. And this then is what the research will aim to find out. So this is a clear focus on the study. Now, let's look into the research problem as an endpoint. The endpoint as initially perceived, and this is a case from a student I've been supervising some years ago, which was about institutions of higher education have a desire to create a diverse student body so that these positive impacts can support their overall mission and can achieve creating a diverse student body. And for doing so, they utilize race-conscious admission practices. However, affirmative action in higher education is promoted through the use of an admission program that accords preferences on the basis of characteristics desired in the incoming class, most notably on the basis of race and ethnicity. Now, the practice of considering race within higher education admission is unfortunately or fortunately technical illegal. So this is a tool, while it lends itself to be used to create diversity, that cannot be used because it violates federal and state level legislation, but has been allowed by the Supreme Court to be used in limited situations. So very limited, it can be used. The existing legislation creates a complicated legal framework that must be understood in order to operate without undertaking illegal activities. Now, if you are working at a university in this situation, you want to assure that there will be a diverse student population, and therefore you make use of race-conscious admission practices. You will find yourself in a tricky situation of not violating the law on the one hand, and on the other hand, of still using this tool so to achieve what you want to do. So at the beginning, what was clear in this research is that it is a very complex situation, but everything else was quite nebulous. As the research progressed over several years, the endpoint becomes understood and quite clear. Namely, affirmative action in college admissions is a contentious topic which has inspired a significant amount of legislation affecting its use. This legislation exists independently at the state and federal levels, but when viewed together within the entire legislative framework, individual pieces of legislation contradict each other, providing confusion and conflicting legal guidance for higher education admission counselors. Admission counselors' daily activities are governed by this legislation, but without a high level of knowledge or awareness, admissions counselors could unknowingly engage in recruiting activities that violate one or more aspects of the related legislation. Now, this is a thesis abstract, which, while put at the beginning of the thesis, was only be understood at the end of the research journey. So while it clearly is a complex situation, the real problem, as it was ultimately understood, was within the contradicting legislation. And only once having that holistic understanding about that, one could do any mitigation attempts so to deal with that situation. Now, you see, this is an example for the research being the research problem being the endpoint of the research. Now, what does that show us also? It shows us that problem framing is an iterative process. Independently how well the problem is understood at the beginning of your research journey, it will be much better and more fully understood at the end. So it's not a one-time action, but constructing problem statements is usually a formative process. That is, the first draft rarely are acceptable, but they serve an important function in helping to progressively sharpen the logic and illuminate the various options. This is a highly recommendable paper that you might want to be looking at, because it also provides us with a good understanding about why is there an apparent difficulty in developing a problem understanding. Now, over the course of the past 7 to 8 years, I've been working with roughly, with more than 500 students at doctoral level together. And there is one commonality across most of them. Articulating problems is difficult. And as this article puts it, regardless of the nature of the doctoral program, the one constant for all dissertations and for all research for that matter is a need to state the problem of the study based on the scholarly literature. Doctoral programs commonly require that students take a sequence of research courses that usually focus on how to carry out a study. That is the design, the methodology, and the data analysis techniques, whether they be quantitative or qualitative in nature. Unfortunately, what is often omitted from most research sequences is an understanding of what constitutes a research problem in the first place and how to articulate the problem statement in a logical manner. Now, unfortunately, this observation from a dear colleague is very, very true. And most supervisors don't pay enough attention of working with their students together and showing them first what is the concept of a problem. Now, things become even more tricky because you will be asked to state the problem of the study based on the scholarly literature. Now, if you don't have an understanding about the problem, you don't know what's the relevant literature. Therefore, it will be very hard and difficult for you to state the problem within the scholarly literature at an initial stage. As you go along, as you understand what is a research problem in the first instance, you then can connect the literature surrounding the problem together with the understanding of the problem. And this then actually is a front and back juggling, so to gradually build up the problem understanding and to articulate the problem in a logical manner, which, as a matter of fact, is a way of testing yourself how well you understand the problem. If you can express it in a single sentence, it will be very clear to you. If you need 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes and you're just still not getting it nailed out, likelihood is great, you haven't understood it for yourself. And this, as a matter of fact, is not a tragedy, it's just showing where you are in your research process. Now, all of those things together obviously and unfortunately make it quite challenging to start off. But if you understand slowly what the problem is and work it out, it will allow you to gradually progress on that end. Now, understanding how well is it focused. Research problems do not exist in nature, just waiting to be plucked out by some observant researcher. Instead, they are artificial entities and identified a gap of information and understanding within a topic. So it's you framing the research, you framing the gap, and more often it is rather information and understanding gaps than a general gap in the literature. Often once students say, well, I asked Google and actually I only got 5 hits, it's a too narrow search. And it's a clear sign of information and understanding gap in your own knowledge. So as you go along, as more you will be able to articulate and to talk with Google and getting out of the information. Now, if you look at this piece of advice from Jacobs, it's very valuable. However, it comes down to a bottom line message, which is keep it simple, keep the focus on the problem, and the support provided for 2 students might be as simple as, for the start, let's keep it really simple and just tell me what is broke in that situation. If there's nothing broken, reconsider why is this a problem. Now, why is it so hard to understand about problems? Because we are living in a world which is framed by solutions. You are not given a chance, not a minute in a day, to think about problems. You are expected to perform by solutions. So, drawing on corporate experience and practices makes you struggle to craft a research problem. Students often want to work towards a solution or want to improve something, not even knowing why there is a need for improvement. And many of the guides found on the web aren't of help, as they are written by advanced researchers and therefore often mislead the novice. They are biased by the target audience, such as pitching research to funding agencies. Now, and this is a concrete case. Most and many of the studies that you come across have a purpose, and the purpose is not to serve you, it's not to serve the reader, but it's to serve the funding, the donor organization. Now, this is a tricky thing, right? Because if you want to serve to those target audience, you must show success. You must show achievement. You won't show failure. If you look at research, however, it's purely about looking into problems. Therefore, any solutions that might come about will be built up over the problem end and not over the solution end. Now, unfortunately, problems are also on top of that, not that seducing. So it's really easy to get excited into a solution-driven way. Solutions are exciting, especially those that you are part of creating, and the ideas behind, and how to make them alive. Now, the solution bias is very common amongst us, including solution consultants. We know a problem, we've seen a certain solution work, we usually end up promoting that, citing the previous success. It's a bit of the hammer and nail. If you have a hammer in the hand, likelihood is great, you everywhere see nails. Now, how can we overcome that and control ourselves on which side we are working? Now, I think we might want to work over the dark side. If we see a problem and rush to build a solution, we do everything in our power to bring the idea to life. But then we often miss the mark. In reality, we should focus on the problems intently. By understanding the real underlying causes of the trouble, we can build the right solution. It's not that creating a solution quickly is a bad thing. However, it is when it's the wrong solution. So the question would be solution to what? As long as you haven't understood the problem fully. Now, to make things even worse, what comes often ahead with solutions is excitement and opportunities. If you just look into digital technologies, they are so cool because they provide you with so many opportunities. You could, and there you go. You spend the next 95% of your action, 59% of your actions on envisioning something exciting that could be done. Meanwhile, in contrary, you might want to ask yourself, what for do you use the technology? So this is a very dangerous thing, being driven by opportunities. In an area when a problem-solving motive is near hegemonic, think here of evidence-based policy and contemporary Western eagerness to produce students as problem solvers. What the problem used to be's approach serves as a much needed interruption to the presumption that problems are fixed, uncontroversial starting points for policy development. It reminds us that the banal and vague notion of the problem and its partners, the solution, are heavily laden with meaning. To probe this meaning, the WPR approach recommends problem questioning as a form of critical practice. Now, practicing in articulating problems and understanding problems and in seeing what the value and meaning is we project into them can be a way that helps us to correct our solution-focused lens and to turn it into a more conscious problem-focused research tool to be applied through the research. Now this, as much as problem framing, is a very iterative process and perhaps one of the key learnings that you might take out of the doctoral study. So you might as well degree without that knowledge and understanding. There will be many supervisors that still have not developed that practice up to the expectations. So exactly, you can control yourself very simple and ask to what is this a solution? Can you answer that question? If not, then you likely haven't understood the problem in the first instance. So now, and to link it to the literature, how to read the literature with a problem focus. Now, I think for the start, it's important to ask the right questions. Are your questions just projecting outcome expectations? Like, what should we do? Oh yeah, that's a good open question. And it's an exciting question because it invites us to speculate, to envision, and to do all of the things that are awesome, cool, exciting, motivating, but it also entirely is diverting our attention away from where it should be spent. What are the criteria based that we are evaluating of what we might be doing? Is budget an issue, like in this case? Then we must look into initial cost and budget and the time to roll out, and then expectations and the ways we could progress from here. Now, you see, this is a very technical and non-sexy way of looking into things. However, it is a way that allows us to frame questions that are looking into problems, into causes, into effects and to not operate over some random outcome expectations. Now, if we work over criteria, then we well can ask us the question, what is the purpose of consulting, for example, the literature? Do we consult it just for building up our personal knowledge of that field, of that domain? And I think it's fair that over 90% of what you will be read during your doctoral study will not end up in your thesis, but the main purpose of reading it is just for you to build up the required knowledge gradually. Now you can either spend those 90% upfront and take the first 1-2 years consulting the literature, or you work over criteria and therefore reduce the time that initially is required to consult the literature and rather spend it gradually as you go along, and therefore make much better use of the time and the sources that you select from the literature, because you will not look into any outcome-driven literature sources, but you will look instead over the criteria, very focused, and then not end up finding a solution, but to explore the problem. And this will allow you to identify from the literature related studies, and related studies are your real friend that can super boost your research, because it provides you with all that you need. It provides you with answers, with questions, with methods, with boundaries. It's a friend that you want to have on your side. Working over the criteria means the likelihood is great you will get there quite quickly. Now, let's look into a problem-focused literature review. Do the test and check if your writing has a clear problem focus afterwards. Now, in this case, humans hold a limited capacity for worrying. Negative. They have a finite pool of worry. Looks at negatives. Therefore, tending to fewer near-term threats, negative, as more relevant and of greater urgency, negative, than caring about future problems, negative. People thus tend not to immediately react to threats, negatives, that may manifest themselves in the distant future, but rather look for balancing long-range worries, negative, with the demands of more immediate concerns. So you see, everything here is focused at understanding and examining a problem. And it's working over criteria, not over conclusions. So if you look into your own writing, it's very simple for you to understand your way of working, your way of interacting with the literature, and what is the focus of your work. And as said, questions matter, because a wrong question and a wrong focus inevitably will put your work off the track. If you're looking for a solution, then the likelihood is great that the questions are likewise asking for solutions and will not explore a problem. Now let's look into a concrete example on how that could be. Now, here we compare a solution versus a problem-focused question framing example, whereby the problem statement is the same for both of the cases. The student dorms currently do not have air conditioning units, and during the hot seasons, it is common for room temperatures to exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Many students report that they are unable to do homework in their dorm rooms. Others report having problems sleeping because of the humidity and temperature. The rooms are unhealthy and inhibit students' productivity and academic achievement. Now, this is a starting condition for both, for a solution-focused and for a problem-focused question. A solution-focused question would be, how can we make dorms more hospitable? This invites you to speculate. Now, the problem-focused question, on the other hand, asks a simple question as a starting point. Why are there no air conditionings in the dorms? So, depending on the avenues that you go down, your further actions will be driven in accordance to that. The research purposes from a solution perspective would be, in response to this problem, our study proposes to investigate several options for making the dorms more hospitable. We plan to carry out an all-inclusive participatory investigation into options for purchasing air conditioners and different types of air conditioning. We will also consider less expensive ways to mitigate some or all of the problems noted above, such as creating climate-controlled dorm lounges and equipping them with better study areas and computing spaces. Now, unfortunately, this is a real case that was taken from a real website, which really will be read by you and will provide you with guidance or misguidance on how to carry out your research. Now, what should have been done would have been a problem-focused approach in which the purpose of the research is, in response to this problem, our study proposes to investigate why there are no air conditionings in the dorm. We plan to carry out an all-inclusive participatory investigation, so to understand why no air conditionings had been installed thus far. We will investigate if the non-existence is due to economic, regulatory, budget, technical, or other unknown issues. So you keep it very structured, but also open-minded in the outcome expectations. And depending on the way that you choose, the research outcome will be very different. And this can be identified in just 3 words. In the solution case, we hope to. Very well, there you go. You hope. Hope is not science. Science is evidence-based work and not hope. Now, on the other hand, if you work over the problem perspective, then you will have a better understanding. And therefore, your outcome and results are presented against the data and evidence that you have been collecting. So I hope that this illustrated a bit how the 2 different lanes can go very different directions down and how one can bring you to the outcomes that you want to reach, while the others will just make you speculating and guessing. Now, talking about evidence and data. How can we practice to draw and compare on evidence and data and not only on conclusions? Now, as much as there is a solution versus problem, the consultation of the literature very much, and in particular, in the early phases of the research, works over conclusions. Means students just pick from what others conclude and work with that, rather than looking into studies and working over the evidence and data. Let's look in this example, evidence-based argument. There are a number of inherent methodological difficulties in evaluating treatment efficacy in this area. And this has contributed to controversy within the research literature surrounding treatment outcomes for this group of offenders. Now you see group and offenders as 2 words that are in the following consequently reused. Reason being, this is data and evidence that is looked at in this argument. Now this is a clear way for working over evidence. Contrary to that, let's compare directly a conclusion versus an evidence-based argument. Now, let's start on the right side with a conclusion-based argument, which is taken from just a random thesis, and where you can see the yellow part, which is the state of susceptibility to harm from exposure to stresses associated with environmental and social change, and from the absence of capacity to adapt. This is a finding from Etcher. The degree of vulnerability in an earthquake hazard depends on the capacity and resilience of humans in coping with the hazard facing them. This is a finding from Norris. Population growth and rapid unplanned urbanization. This is a finding from Ali et al. And Solfagari. And the deficit of policies aimed towards the reform of flawed construction practices and the poor planning of land usage due to the rapid growth of urban areas. Another finding from Ali. Now, what do you really want to work and achieve with just working over conclusions? It's providing a very limited utility for you to draw on. Against what would be the question here again? Let's look at the evidence-based argument on the left side. The reason for attrition rates of 52.17% in doctoral programs in accordance to OECD data have been actively explored in the recent years. Research suggests that a number of problem domains appear to persist that apply to both immediate doctoral students, those that engage in a doctoral after a master's study, as well as adult doctoral students, those that first worked a bit and then come back into the education sector, will apply. Such common problem domains are the inability to cope with work that has no clearly defined deadlines and milestones, as well as B, a difficulty in problematizing and analytical and critical thinking skills. Now, this works over evidence and findings of other studies. While that is a fake case made up, it still shows you the difference in between picking on data and evidence versus just picking on conclusion. So as much as solution versus problem-based, that applies to conclusion versus evidence-based literature consulting. And I hope this becomes clear through this example. Now, another thing that often comes on top of that, and it's again in the light of excitement and opportunities and being just more appealing, is to mix in noise. Let's take this example from a report again that you would have consulted as part of your study and thought that's a credible resource, where you read something like, everybody is talking about the Internet of Things, a buzzword supposed to magically solve all challenges inherent in digital transformation. With such projections, company leaders feel the urge to invest in IoT, but are often held back by a lack of accurate and credible calculations for the expected return on potential initiatives. According to our HBR Pulse survey, 80 to 90% of respondents can't accurately measure ROIs for their initiatives. Not to lose traction against their competitors, some companies even start initiatives or projects without a proper business case at hand. Unsurprisingly, failure rates of digital transformation initiatives lie in the range of 60 to 85%. The good news is that most of the elite groups that do measure returns are seeing relatively quick paybacks. Now, this was intentionally written to excite you and to catch you as a reader. But if you look from a scientific perspective into that and see and evaluate what actually is the issues in there, then you will see challenges inherent in digital transformation. That is not an issue, but a challenge, and a quite generic one. It's not specific. Lack of accurate and credible calculations for the expected returns on potential initiatives. That is not an issue, but a clear problem. So why is this lack there, we could ask, and how is this unique or different for the IoT case? Start initiatives or projects without a proper business case at hand. Now, that's not an issue, but a question about informed decisions. Why do you do something that you don't understand? Failure rates of digital transformation initiatives lie in the range of 60 to 85%. Now, that's not an issue. It's a conclusion based on evidence. So we know what couldn't be done to avoid it by consulting further the literature on exactly this being the case. Now, if you look at this article from that perspective, you will understand there's a lot of noise, but from a scientific perspective, it provides you with little value in contradicting and perhaps misleading information mixed together. So with this, we come towards the end of the monologue. And if you want to learn more about how to read the literature with a problem focus, check out our advanced training course on critical analysis and drawing on the literature, which comes in 3 study formats: free self-study with peer support, fully tutored, or with flexible on-demand feedback. And as said, our website currently is expecting technical difficulties that will be hopefully solved at the end of the day. And at that point, you can access this course and take a look into that. And with this, I kindly ask Jack to stop the recording. So to move into the group activity and to open the floor to everyone who might have a question and would like to put it forward. Jack, might I ask you to stop the recording?